Darwinist view. In fact, in many ways, creationism and Darwinism are mirror images of each other. They are really almost religious beliefs, both of them. How did I come to write The Facts of Life? Well, at first my interest was purely in geology. I wanted to collect rock and fossil specimens. That made me begin to question the evidence that I was seeing in the museum, and I wanted to find out for myself exactly what evidence there was to support Darwinism. Were the things that I'd been told at school and in college, were they really true? My own daughter Julia was just starting school. She was going to be taught the same information. Was it right or was it wrong? Well, I spent 10 years in total looking at that evidence again, and I wasn't able to find any one thing that I could say for sure was true about Darwinism. I was disturbed to think that young people were being taught as fact something which I knew was really pure conjecture. When The Facts of Life was published, I then realised what a can of worms I'd opened up, because I was immediately accused of being a kind of secret creationist, somebody who had a hidden agenda. It seemed that scientists found it impossible to believe that any rational person could seriously question a theory that they believed in and had believed in all their lives. And I encountered the most intemperate, I was called stupid, loony, that I was told that I was writing drivel. It was suggested I needed psychiatric help. Prominent scientists were wheeled out to barrage me with personal abuse as a way of just doing away with this troublesome journalist. In a way, I almost sympathise with some of my critics, because they found it literally impossible to believe that somebody could seriously question Darwinism. They found it literally impossible. They were locked in so far to that view that they just couldn't interpret the evidence that was in front of them in any other way other than as being Darwinist. And to them, any attempt to criticise Darwinism had to be the work of either a madman or a creationist. There was just no other way. I think they were unable to conceive that there was an alternative theory, because Darwinism has somehow worked itself into the fabric of our whole scientific and educational system. It's almost the backbone, really, of our scientific thinking. In the life sciences, there just is no alternative theory. It underpins everything. I think also there is a sense in which they're afraid to open themselves to new possibilities, just in case that there's one chink in the armour that is going to bring about the unravelling of the whole fabric of science. I think most people educated in a developed country in the last 50 years have been taught that Darwinism is an absolutely solid theory and that it's backed up by evidence both in the laboratory and in the field. And I think most of those people would be surprised to hear that, in fact, the theory is largely conjecture, and what we've been offered as evidence, when you examine it closely, it simply melts away. For example, the kind of evidence that we've been offered regarding the peppered moth, the evolution of horses, Archaeopteryx, you know, that's the animal that's half reptile, half bird. All this physical evidence that we've been offered and which is in the museums to be examined, when you examine it closely, you find it just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. An important question which you can ask here is, what exactly constitutes a scientific theory? Now, there's been a lot of argument about this, but certainly there is a definition of a scientific theory, and Darwinism does not meet that criterion at all. Basically, a scientific theory is something which must be capable of being falsified if it's true. But Darwinism can't be falsified. It's an infinitely elastic theory. It just simply gobbles up all and every evidence it's offered and says, oh yes, that proves Darwinism is true. In one sense, you can understand people's reluctance to drop Darwinism, because apart from the fact that it's an attractive theory, there is also a scientific principle. It's called the principle of tenacity, that you shouldn't junk ideas just because a few anomalies have come along. The trouble is that the anomalies with Darwinism are so enormous that they're now greater than the theory itself, and so we should start questioning this principle of tenacity. We should start questioning, should we be hanging on to this theory regardless? Some people have said to me, how can you criticise a theory if you don't have something to replace it with? Well, I don't accept that. If the emperor hasn't got any clothes on, then the emperor hasn't got any clothes on. It's not my fault. A lot of people are rather prone to shoot the messenger because they don't like the message. It seems to me that if Darwinism is wrong, then somebody has got to point the finger. I suppose if you ask me to evaluate Darwinism, I'd say that there is a certain amount of weak circumstantial evidence in favour of natural selection having some influence on evolution. But if you ask me to say, can this account for the origin of species, that's the question that Darwin was trying to answer, I'd have to say, no, it can't account for the origin of species. Natural selection is significant in evolutionary terms in one sense, and that is that it can account for variation within a species. For example, how you can have a light moth and a dark moth, and how one can change into the other. You could also point to the Darwin's finches in the Galapagos Islands, where they say that there are 14 different species, each adapted to a different island. Actually, they're all members of the same species. Is there any evidence that the rocks of the Earth's crust have formed rapidly and all at once rather than slowly over billions of years? Well, yes, there is a certain amount of evidence, and ironically, there's a piece of it standing right outside the Natural History Museum in London. There you'll find there's a fossil tree. It's maybe 30 feet tall. What does this tell us? Well, if a tree is going to be buried and fossilised in something that's going to become rock, it obviously has to be buried all at once, otherwise the tree will simply rot away. Anybody can see that. This tree, in order to become fossilised, had to be buried in 30, 50, 100 feet of sediment very rapidly. And yet the scientists who work in the Natural History Museum continue to believe that the rocks of the Earth's crust had to be formed very, very slowly over billions of years, just tiny amounts of sediment being deposited each year. There's plenty of other evidence of rocks being formed relatively quickly through apparently some kind of catastrophe. For example, on every continent there are beds full of the bones of millions of animals. And you can contrast this with cases that we know of where millions of animals have been killed but haven't turned into fossils. For instance, on the Great Plains of America there were 60 million buffalo when white settlers arrived. They were all killed in a very short space of time. But there are no buffalo beds forming on the Great Plains. Those animals, after they were killed, they were simply eaten by scavengers. When you look at buildings like London's Natural History Museum, it looks almost like a cathedral or a church, and in a way I suppose it is a kind of cathedral or church, or at least it's a temple to Darwinism. Inside you have all the exhibits that are meant to show that Darwinism is true. I've looked in that museum and many other museums, but I haven't been able to find the evidence that conclusively proves that Darwinism is true. But many, many people go to worship at that shrine, and many people do believe in Darwinism. I suppose you could call it a kind of religion. People come to museums like the Natural History Museum to have their questions answered. Is man related to the apes? Do man and the ape share a common ancestor? And when you look at the exhibits in the museum, you'd think that the question had been answered decisively, yes, we are related to the apes. What the museum doesn't tell you is that the exhibit is an interpretation of the fossils. It's a point of view, it's a Darwinian interpretation, and you won't find any other interpretation either in the Natural History Museum or any other museum. In one sense, I sympathise with Darwinists because they're simply looking for a rational explanation of the biological facts, and Darwinism is a rational explanation, a reasonable explanation. The trouble is, it simply isn't supported by the evidence. Let me give you one example, the famous Lucy skeleton that was recently found in Africa. The few bones that were discovered have been restored or interpreted as a missing link creature, half human, half ape. But it's important to bear in mind that those bones can be and have been put together in different ways to show different creatures. For example, an extinct ape who's not related to humans at all. The creature that's represented by Lucy, Australopithecus, is in fact the only so-called missing link that stands any chance of being recognised as a human ancestor. But as long ago as the 1950s, the eminent zoologist Sir Solly Zuckerman did a statistical analysis which concluded that Australopithecus was an ape-like creature and not a human-like creature. Yet Darwinists continue to believe that Australopithecines, like Lucy, are our ancestors. Darwinists have promised us a missing link, and so they've got to deliver. They've got to come up with one. Any missing link will do, it seems. Every so often a skeleton is found in Africa. Its discoverers describe it as being the missing link. The headlines come and go, and then later on, that skeleton, those bones are reclassified either as human or as ape. And so far, the missing link is still missing. Forbidden science sounds like a contradiction in terms, but what I mean by it is this. We're all familiar with the fact that Galileo was tried by the Inquisition and compelled to recant his belief that the Earth went round the sun. Now, that's not what I mean by forbidden science. That's really human nature, because we all of us tend to reject the new. But the members of the Inquisition that tried Galileo refused to look through his telescope. They refused to look at the evidence that would have told them he was quite right. And that's what I mean by forbidden science. It's the refusal by some